The first thing a man noticed about Silver Vein wasn't the promise of wealth, but the sound of it being built. The hammering started before dawn and carried through the day like the heartbeat of something half alive and half dream. In the shadow of the Wind River Range, the air smelled of pine pitch, sweat, and the faint tang of gun oil. Oxen groaned in their traces. Saws shrieked through green timber. Out on the rise above the river, where the prairie met the first shoulder of the mountains, 100 tents and shacks glittered beneath the morning sun like flakes of fool's silver scattered across the dust. Silver Vein wasn't on any map, and by the time the maps caught up, it was already dying. It began with a rumor that somewhere in the gray seams of the foothills, a prospector named Jonas Pike had found a streak of ore that shone like moonlight under his pick. He brought a handful of it down to the traders' camp near South Pass, showing it off for whiskey and bragging rights. A few flakes were all it took. Within weeks, wagons were crawling over the Oregon Trail toward the Wind River country, filled with men chasing a glitter that never existed. By the time the leaves turned in '48, Silver Vein was a town or something close enough to one that the difference hardly mattered. There was a livery, 2 saloons, a blacksmith's forge, and a street that didn't know where it was going. The settlers built with what they had: logs dragged from the pines, stones from the riverbed, and the raw nerve of people who thought luck was something you could grab and hold. In the evenings, the clang of hammers gave way to fiddle music leaking from the door of May Corbin's Silver Lantern Saloon. The place glowed through the smoke like a lantern in a snowstorm, drawing gamblers, trappers, and emigrants off the trail. The laughter inside was loud, but it never quite drowned out the wind, that thin, restless sound that scraped across the plains, as if reminding everyone that the mountains were watching. It was around that time Sheriff Nathaniel Burdett rode in. Folks just called him Nate. He came alone out of the east, a lean man with eyes the color of spent gunmetal and a coat that had seen a dozen winters. His horse was trail-worn and his rifle older than most of the men drinking in the saloons. He'd been a trapper once, one of Bridger's men in the old days, when the beaver trade was still worth dying for and the Missouri ran thick with pelts. He'd trapped along the Yellowstone, wintered with the Crow, and carried scars on his hands that no story could quite explain. When the fur trade died, so did a part of him, and like many of his breed, he drifted eastward long enough to learn that civilization didn't suit him either. So when the call came for a lawman in a town nobody had heard of, he saddled up and rode west again. The men who met him at the edge of town sized him up the way wolves measure another predator: curious, cautious, half respectful. The Council of Miners and Merchants, such as it was, handed him a star cut from brass and told him Silver Vein needed law. Burdett looked around at the whiskey tents, the dust, the half-built dreams, and muttered, "Law's the last thing you'll find here." But he pinned on the badge anyway. His first night, he slept in the half-finished jailhouse, a square of green timber still sticky with sap. The air inside was heavy with sawdust and the faint perfume of pine smoke drifting from campfires down the slope. Through the cracks in the walls he could see the flicker of lanterns moving like fireflies across the settlement. Laughter, curses, and the far-off whinny of a horse wove through the night. Somewhere in the dark, a hammer kept tapping some fool working past midnight, chasing the sunrise. By daylight, Burdett rode the town's single street, tipping his hat to whoever nodded first. He made no speeches, asked no favors, and when 2 men started arguing over a claim stake outside the assay tent, he settled it with a few quiet words and the weight of his stare. The story spread quick. The new sheriff didn't shout, didn't drink on duty, and didn't miss when he drew. Within a week, the fights moved outside the town limits. Within a month, people started calling him the one steady thing in a place made of wind. Still, he knew what the rest refused to see. The river that cut through the valley, a narrow, bright ribbon of meltwater, was already running lower than it should. The banks had begun to crumble where miners dug too close, muddying the current until the fish disappeared. The mountains themselves seemed uneasy, their snowcaps shrinking early that summer. When the wind turned, it carried a dry, hollow scent, like something scorched before its time. At night, Burdett would sit on the jailhouse steps with a tin cup of coffee, watching the lanterns wink out one by one. He'd seen it before at Fort William, at the Green River camps, even at the rendezvous along the Popo Agi places that flared bright and vanished once the profit went dry. He thought of the trappers who once ruled these hills, Smith, Bridger, Beckworth, men who'd carved a life out of nothing but grit and wilderness, and when their trade was gone, had faded into it without complaint. They had lived hard, but honest. This new kind of frontier, all rumor and greed, felt different. It had the smell of desperation, not adventure. Still, Silver Vein grew. Emigrant wagons on their way to Oregon stopped to rest and trade. A merchant from Street Lewis built a proper store. May Corbin's saloon added a piano. For a brief stretch, it seemed the town might stick. Letters were sent back east boasting of fortune, and more wagons rolled in. The air filled with sawdust, sweat, and blind hope. But beneath all that noise, the land whispered something else. Prairie dogs vanished from their mounds. The willows along the creek turned yellow too soon. Even the horses grew jumpy, snorting at things unseen. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the Wind Rivers, painting the peaks in blood and copper, Burdett rode out past the last shanty toward the foothills. The wind carried dust like smoke, and the horizon shimmered with heat. He reined in by the shallow creek and looked back. The whole of Silver Vein lay below him, glowing gold in the dying light, beautiful, foolish, doomed. He thought of Independence Rock, where travelers carved their names into granite, hoping to be remembered. Of Fort Bridger, that outpost of commerce and survival where men traded pelts for powder and tails for whiskey. Those places endured because they served a purpose greater than profit. Silver Vein had no such reason to live. As he turned his horse back toward town, a dust devil twisted up from the road and scattered a half-built fence like straw. Burdett watched it dance across the valley, thin and wild as a warning. The next morning, when he walked down the street, he found a new sign nailed to the saloon door, Silver Vein City, population 412. He almost laughed. The paint was still wet, running down like tears. The town didn't know it yet, but it was already dying. By the time the first snow dusted the Wind River foothills, Sheriff Nathaniel Burdett had settled into his post like an old knife in a familiar sheath. Silver Vein had grown fast, too fast, and like anything that rose without roots, it creaked under its own weight. The saloons ran late, the gambling tables fuller than the church benches, and the hills echoed with pickaxes and curses long after sunset. Burdett rode those hills most mornings, checking the diggings and the claim lines that crisscrossed the ridges like scars. He rode not because he trusted the miners, but because he trusted the land even less. Out there, the ground itself felt uneasy. The shale cracked underfoot, the gullies shifted after every rain. He'd seen that kind of country before, restless, ready to fold back over anything foolish enough to dig too deep. He rode alone, as always. The deputy, a boy named Clay Benson, was better at cards than courage. "Sheriff," the kid would say, "this ain't no outlaw town. Ain't nothing here needs shooting." Burdett would only grunt. Not yet. He'd learned long ago that trouble didn't need much of a reason. In the mountains, it could come as a snow squall or a grizzly. In town, it came wearing a grin and a drink. Before Silver Vein, Burdett's trail had been a long and crooked one. He'd ridden with Bridger once back when the Green River still smelled of pine pitch and wet fir, when the mountains were full of promise and not yet full of men. He'd traded with the Crow, hunted with the Arikara, slept under skies so bright with stars they looked close enough to burn. He could still hear Bridger's gravel voice sometimes, telling tales by the fire. "Ain't no law. Past the Platte, Nate. Out here, a man's word is his rope. Hold it tight or hang by it." Back then, Burdett thought law was something you could carry in your hands, a rifle, a knife, a steady aim. But age taught him otherwise. The older he got, the more he learned that law was a kind of belief. It lived only so long as men respected it. And in a place like Silver Vein, belief was the rarest ore of all. The town was changing. You could smell it in the air, whiskey, smoke, and the sour tang of greed. The 2 saloons had multiplied into 4. A gambler named Wicks ran a faro table in May Corbin's place and claimed to have seen Kit Carson himself in Santa Fe. Half the trappers who wandered in told the same lies that they'd known Beckworth or fought beside Jim Bridger at Pierre's Hole or traded with the Blackfeet. Burdett never called them out. He'd known those men for real and carried too many ghosts to bother arguing. At times, though, the past came calling in, flesh and blood. One cold afternoon, a wagon rolled in from Fort Bridger, bringing a trader with one arm and a memory like a ledger. The man squinted at Burdett and grinned. "Nate Burdett, by God, I thought you froze to death on the Yellowstone." "Nearly did," Burdett replied. "Got better." They shared coffee in the shade of the livery, talking of old trails and lost friends, Jed Smith torn by the Mojave, Glass by the Ree, sublet by sickness. All the mountain men were dying off or turning into something else, guides, scouts, sheriffs, or drunks. The trader spat into the dust. "World's changing, Nate. Ain't room for our kind anymore." Burdett looked toward the peaks, their tops wreathed in snow and distance. "Maybe not," he said. "But the mountains don't care. They never did." That night, the sheriff walked the street long after midnight. The moon was thin, the wind sharp as a file. The town slept uneasily, dogs whining, shutters rattling, the faint hum of dice and laughter leaking through thin walls. He stopped outside May's saloon, where light still spilled through the cracks. May Corbin stood behind the bar polishing a glass, her auburn hair pinned up loose. "You look like a man thinking too hard," she said. "I'm paid to," he answered. She laughed a low, smoky sound. "This place'll wear you out faster than the trail ever did." "Maybe," Burdett said, glancing at the tables, the weary faces hunched over their luck. "But at least the trail was honest." May leaned on the counter. "Honest doesn't build a town, Nate." He looked at her a long moment. "No," he said quietly, "but it keeps one standing." By spring, the thaw came late and mean. The river overflowed, washing away 2 of the lower shanties. Men grumbled but kept digging, convinced the next strike would set them free. One morning, Jonas Pike, the same man whose discovery had birthed the town, stumbled into the street, with a lump of ore and eyes wild from drink. "Hit the mother vein," he shouted. "Silver solid as church bells." Half the town followed him into the hills before breakfast. Burdett followed too, not out of faith, but out of duty. What they found was a fissure, deep, glittering, and worthless. Mica and galena, nothing more. The miners cursed, the gamblers laughed, and the hills echoed it back like mockery. When the crowd finally broke apart, Pike sat by the creek, staring at his reflection. "Guess I fooled us all," he said. Burdett knelt beside him. "You didn't fool the land," he said. "It was empty to start with." That evening, the wind picked up, dry and restless. Dust blew through the streets like smoke. The river, once bright and clear, ran dull as pewter. Burdett stood outside the jailhouse, watching the sky turn the color of old brass. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder rumbled, not a storm yet, but a warning. He thought of Bridger again, of how the old trapper once said, the West would never be tamed, only endured. Maybe that was why Burdett had come not to keep order, but to stand witness as another dream burned itself out against the mountains. And as night fell over Silver Vein, the wind howled down the empty gulch, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter, the kind that only ghosts and gamblers understand. By the summer of 1850, Silver Vein was a living thing, loud, hungry, and mean. The street that once ended in Prairie now ran crooked between 100 rough-built shacks. Every night, the air swelled with the sound of hammers and drunken songs. The town had taken on a pulse of its own, one that quickened with each new rumor of fortune. Sheriff Burdett rode through it like a shadow, silent but always seen. Folks respected him the way they respected thunder, not because they liked it, but because they knew it could split the sky if it wanted to. He kept the peace mostly by watching. His rifle stayed slung on the saddle. But his eyes missed nothing, not the dice games that ran too long, not the whispers of claim jumping up in the hills, and not the restless look that crept into the faces of men who had begun to suspect they'd been fooled. The town had grown fat on a lie, and lies have a way of souring. By July, the ground itself seemed to take offense. The hills around Silver Vein groaned under the weight of the miners' picks. They dug without order or plan, chasing veins that shimmered in torchlight but turned dull by morning. Whole sections of slope collapsed where they tunneled too deep. Horses spooked for no reason, their eyes rolling white. Burdett spent his days patching quarrels before they turned bloody. "You can't fight the mountain," he'd tell them. But men with hunger in their eyes don't listen to reason. Doc Avery, who ran the saloon clinic, told him the dust was making folks sick, too much silica in the lungs, too much liquor in the blood. "This place is a fever," the doctor said one night, leaning over his bottle. "You can't cure it, Nate. Best you can do is wait for it to burn itself out." Burdett didn't answer. He was thinking of the river again. The creek that fed Silver Vein ran thin now, more mud than water. The beavers were gone, the trout too. A man could walk across it without wetting his boots. The sheriff rode upriver one morning and found the cause a dozen makeshift sluices thrown up by miners, diverting the flow to wash gravel for ore that wasn't there. He stood staring at the wasted trickle and felt something tighten in his chest. The land wasn't just dying, it was being bled. Then came the day the earth spoke back. It started with a sound deep, slow, and wrong. Not thunder, not wind, a groan that rolled up from the bones of the hills. Burdett was standing outside the jail when the ground shuddered beneath his boots. The horses screamed. A lantern fell in May Corbin's saloon and shattered, spilling flame across the floorboards. Within moments, the town was chaos, men shouting, women running, walls swaying like they'd gone soft. Burdett kicked through the smoke, throwing a blanket over the fire, shouting orders no one heard. When the tremor passed, half the town was in the street, pale and shaking. "Quake," Doc Avery muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Never felt one up here before." "Maybe the mountain's tired of being picked at," Burdett said. 2 days later, the first mine collapsed. Jonas Pike had been down in shaft number 3 with 3 others when it happened. They dug too close to an underground spring, and the ceiling gave way in a roar of mud and rock. The rescue took a full day, but by the time Burdett pulled them out, only one man was breathing. Pike's body was half buried, his hand still gripping the useless pick. The survivors looked at the sheriff with eyes full of blame, as if he'd built the mine himself. Burdett said nothing, just covered Pike's face with his hat. That night, he sat alone behind the jail, staring at the stars. The air smelled of rain, though no clouds showed. The wind whispered down from the mountains, carrying dust that stung his eyes. He thought of other towns that had risen fast and fallen faster, ghost places along the Platte, names worn off by weather. He'd seen this kind of fever before, in men and in nations. The hunger for more, the refusal to see when the vein had run dry. May Corbin found him there near dawn. She brought a lantern and 2 tin cups of coffee. "You can't save a place that doesn't want saving," she said. Burdett rubbed the grit from his beard. "Wasn't trying to, just thought it might hold together a little longer." May sat beside him. "Maybe it was never meant to. The land takes back what it gives." He looked toward the hills, where the mine fires still burned like angry stars. And it always collects the debt. By August, the mood in town turned mean. Fights broke out nightly. Knives flashed quicker than cards. Whole families packed their wagons and left without a word. Those who stayed dug deeper, hoping the mountain would change its mind. Burdett posted a notice on the jail door: all mining to cease until further order. By sunset, the paper was torn down and trampled. That night, a windstorm rolled out of the west, fierce, dry, relentless. It stripped roofs, toppled fences, and filled every crack with grit. The dust turned the air copper, the sky vanishing into a swirling darkness. From the ridge above town, the lanterns of Silver Vein flickered like fireflies caught in a storm. Burdett stood in the middle of the street, his duster snapping in the gale, and thought he could hear the mountain laughing. When the storm finally passed, the town looked smaller. Half the signs were gone, the streets buried under drifts of sand. In the silence that followed, even the wind seemed ashamed. Sheriff Nathaniel Burdett walked the length of that ruined street and knew, without needing to say it aloud, that Silver Vein's luck had broken for good. The earth had spoken once, it would not need to speak twice. By the time autumn crept down from the Wind River peaks, the people of Silver Vein had begun to vanish like smoke. It happened quietly, at first a wagon rolling out at dawn, another at dusk, the sound of wheels fading into the prairie wind. Then one morning, Sheriff Nathaniel Burdett woke to find a third of the shanties empty and the saloon piano silent for the first time in months. The miners were the first to go. When the veins turned out false and the earth swallowed their tunnels, there was nothing left to keep them. They left behind broken shovels, splintered sluices, and the hollow echo of dreams turned brittle. The gamblers followed, moving on to the next rumor, the next strike, waiting in the Nevada deserts or up toward the Salmon River country. Only the stubborn and the lost remained, the kind of people who had nowhere else to run. Burdett stayed because that's what lawmen did. He'd taken the badge to keep order, and though the town itself was coming apart like rotten timber, he meant to see it through. The wind changed that month. It came colder, sharper, cutting down from the mountains with a promise of early snow. Dust devils stalked the empty lots, stirring scraps of paper and torn shingles into the air. Even the dogs had gone quiet. May Corbin kept her saloon open, though most nights she poured whiskey for ghosts. She'd light one lamp, polish the bar until it gleamed, and wait. Burdett made a habit of stopping in each evening, more out of duty than thirst. One night she slid a cup toward him and said, "You could leave too, you know." He didn't answer at first. The flame from the lamp flickered in the empty mirror behind her, throwing strange shadows across the bottles. "Man's got to finish what he starts," he said at last. She gave a weary smile. "That's the kind of thinking that gets men buried." "Maybe so," he said, "but I'd rather be buried standing where I belong." May sighed, glancing toward the window where the wind clawed at the shutters. "Belong," she repeated softly. "You ever wonder if anyone truly belongs out here?" Burdett didn't answer. The question was too big for words. The preacher came next, a tall, hollow-eyed man in a black coat who'd arrived with the miners and never quite fit among them. He took to walking the street at dusk, quoting Revelation and warning of divine judgment. "The Lord's hand is heavy on this valley," he shouted from the steps of the assay office. "He will bury the wicked in the dust they've stirred." People listened because fear always finds an ear. Within a week, a caravan of wagons stood hitched at the edge of town, families loading what they could carry. Burdett tried to reason with them. "You'll freeze before you reach Fort Bridger," he said. An old man spat into the dust. "Better to freeze honest than burn in this cursed hole." By dawn, they were gone. The sheriff kept his rounds, though there was little left to guard. The blacksmith had shuttered his forge. The general store was locked. Only the jail and the saloon showed light after sunset. Burdett wrote his reports by lantern, though there was no one left to read them. He wrote out of habit, the words scrawling rough and simple. October 3. 2 more wagons left. River still low. Air smells wrong. He signed each page, N. Burdett, Sheriff, as if that title still meant something. One afternoon, as he rode the North Ridge, he caught sight of movement below a line of wagons rolling slow through the sage, their canvas tops gleaming in the late sun. He counted 15, maybe 20. The last exodus. He reined in his horse and watched until the line disappeared beyond the horizon. The silence that followed was vast, almost holy. No hammer, no laughter, no voices. Only the creak of saddle leather and the wind whispering through grass. For the first time since he'd arrived, Burdett realized the town had gone still enough for him to hear the land breathe. And beneath that breath, something else, a low rumble, deep and patient, like distant thunder under the ground. He turned his horse toward the creek. The riverbed was nearly dry now, the water sluggish and brown. The banks had begun to collapse, eaten away by the same earth that had swallowed the mines. It looked as if the land itself were pulling the town inward, drawing it back into its ribs. When he returned at dusk, May stood outside the saloon, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "They're saying the ground's splitting in the south meadow," she said. "I saw it," he replied. "This place isn't cursed, May. It's just done with us." She looked up at him, eyes bright with the reflection of the dying sun. "Then what'll you do when it's gone?" "Stay," he said simply. Her jaw tightened. "You can't save a ghost, Nate." He nodded once. "Maybe not, but I can make sure it dies honest." That night, the sky turned strange. The moon came up red through a veil of dust, and the wind carried the smell of ash, though nothing burned. Burdett stood outside the jailhouse, his coat flapping in the cold, and listened to the town settling into silence. One by one, the lamps went out, first in the saloon, then the livery, then the last window in the boarding house. When the final light faded, only the sheriff remained, a single figure standing against the dark. He thought of the mountain men who had come before him, Smith, Bridger, Beckworth, all men who'd faced the wilderness and learned that you could never truly conquer it. You could only make peace with it for a while. The prairie wind shifted, carrying a dry, hollow sound from the hills, the faint crack of earth giving way. Burdett turned toward the sound, hand resting on the butt of his pistol, though there was nothing left to fight but the truth. By morning, Silver Vein would be half buried in dust, its name already fading from memory. But that night, under the cold red moon, the sheriff stood his ground, last witness to a town that should never have been, and last keeper of the law, in a place where the land itself had rendered its final verdict. The night came down heavy and strange. The air over Silver Vein felt thick, like the sky had lowered itself to listen. Sheriff Nathaniel Burdett sat at his desk in the jailhouse, the lantern guttering low, his pen scratching across the last page of his logbook. The sound of it was lonely, the slow rasp of duty in a place long past redemption. October 12. Town near deserted. May's gone east with the last wagons. Wind steady from the mountains. Creek near dry. Heard rumbling again near dusk. He paused, dipped the pen, and added one more line. "If this is the end of it, I reckon it was. Earned." He closed the book and leaned back, listening. Somewhere beyond the walls, the wind moved through the bones of the empty town, whistling through cracks and eaves. The sound reminded him of the long winters on the Yellowstone, those nights when even the wolves stayed silent, and a man could hear the world turning under the ice. He rose, stretched the stiffness from his legs, and stepped outside. The sky above the Wind River Range was low and red, veined with lightning that never touched the ground. "Far off," thunder muttered like a tired god. The air smelled of wet stone and iron, though no rain had fallen in weeks. Burdett walked the length of the street, if it could still be called that, passing the saloon, the store, the leaning frame of the livery. All of them empty now. Doors swung on their hinges, windows gaped dark. He stopped before the saloon. May had left the lamp burning when she went, a single flame in the back window, faint and stubborn. He left it. There, a small act of defiance against the dark. The rumble came again, stronger this time. It rolled through the ground, shaking dust from the roofs, setting the lantern flame trembling. Burdett stood still, hand resting on the butt of his Colt, as if habit might help against whatever was stirring beneath his boots. Then came the crack, sharp, deep, echoing through the valley like a cannon shot. The earth heaved once, twice, and the street split clean down the middle. Boards groaned, nails screamed loose. A section of the lower town, the assay office, 2 shanties, and half the blacksmith's yard simply dropped out of sight in a slow, terrible slide. Burdett staggered backward, clutching the post beside him as the jailhouse walls shuddered. From the open ground beyond, a column of dust rose into the air, thick as smoke. He could taste grit on his tongue, dry and bitter. When the trembling eased, he looked toward the creek, or where the creek had been. It was gone. The bed lay open and empty, the last of the water rushing into a widening hole that yawned beneath the far bank. The sound of it was awful, a gurgling roar, like the earth itself choking on the weight of its own wounds. Within minutes, the channel collapsed, swallowing the last trickle of current and dragging half the hillside with it. Burdett ran. Instinct, not reason, carried him up the ridge road toward the high ground. When he reached the bluff above town, he turned and looked back. Silver Vein was sinking. The old mine shafts had given way, one after another, like dominoes falling into a pit. The street tilted toward the void, timbers splintering, walls folding. A sound rose from it, not human, not even quite natural, the deep moan of land breaking loose from itself. Lanterns flared and died, swallowed in waves of dust. He could do nothing but watch. It went on for what felt like hours, but could only have been minutes. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the motion ceased. The air hung still and choking, full of the smell of wet clay and smoke. The place where the town had stood was now a shallow basin, its edges steaming faintly in the cold. The river, what was left of it, had rerouted itself through the ruins, cutting a muddy ribbon through collapsed roofs and shattered beams. Burdett stood there until the first pale light touched the eastern sky. His horse, miraculously still tethered, shivered beside him, white-eyed and lathered with fear. He walked back down slowly, every step sinking into the soft new ground. The jailhouse had half collapsed, one wall leaning like a broken rib. Inside, his logbook lay open on the desk, pages rippling in the breeze. He tore the last page free, folded it, and slid it into his coat pocket. Then he took his badge, the brass star dulled by dust and sweat, and nailed it to the doorframe. The nail drove in crooked, the metal catching what little light the dawn gave. "This was law once," he muttered, "for whatever that's worth." He looked out over the ruins one last time. The valley was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes after confession. Smoke curled from the earth where timbers still smoldered, and a few blackbirds wheeled above the wreckage, their cries thin and sharp. By midday, the sun burned away the mist, revealing nothing but mud, debris, and silence. Silver Vein was gone, buried under its own greed and the weight of a land that had never wanted it. Burdett saddled his horse and turned west toward the empty hills. He didn't look back. For years afterward, travelers passing through the Wind River country spoke of a hollow place where no grass grew, where the air smelled faintly of metal and ash. Some said it was haunted, that they'd seen a lone rider moving through the ruins at dusk, a man with a weathered coat and a star pinned to his chest. Others said it was just the wind. But the old trappers, the few who still remembered the mountains before men tried to tame them, had another way of saying it. "The earth don't forget," they'd whisper, "and it don't forgive." When the ground stopped shaking and the dust finally settled, Sheriff Nathaniel Burdett found himself standing in a world reborn, stripped bare, quiet as the inside of a church after the congregation's gone home. The place that had once been Silver Vein was now a hollow bowl of mud and ruin. Smoke drifted from the wreckage like breath from a dying body. The river had carved a new path through the center, winding lazily where the main street once stood. For days Burdett wandered among the ruins, not sure if he was searching or simply unable to leave. He found the twisted remains of the blacksmith's anvil, half buried under silt. A child's doll floated face down in a pool where the church steps had been. And near the edge of what was left of the saloon, he found May Corbin's brass lamp still dented but intact. He set it upright on a rock and lit it with a match. The flame wavered in the wind, but didn't die. He took that as a sign, though he wasn't sure of what. He built himself a cabin up on the ridge that overlooked what was left of the town. It was a modest thing, pine logs, a stone hearth, a door that didn't quite fit. He trapped beaver in the high creeks and hunted elk in the aspen groves, living off the land the way he once had before men had tried to turn wilderness into wealth. His days fell into rhythm again. Dawn fire, morning ride, evening silence. At night, he'd sit outside and watch the valley below, where the moonlight pooled across the ruined plain. In the stillness, he thought he could hear echoes, hammer blows, laughter, the jangle of a piano all swallowed long ago. Some nights he spoke aloud to the ghosts, his voice low and steady. "You had your chance," he'd say. "The mountain warned you. The land always warns first." Winter came early that year, hard and blue. Snow lay thick on the ridge by mid-November, and the nights dropped colder than a man's conscience. Burdett hauled in wood and salted meat. He'd spent enough winters alone in the Rockies to know how to survive one more. What he hadn't expected was how different solitude felt now that it wasn't chosen, now that it was earned. He'd once believed the frontier tested a man's endurance, that hunger, cold, and danger proved what a man was made of. But out there, overlooking what was left of Silver Vein, he began to understand it tested something deeper. A man's patience with himself, and with the silence that followed everything he'd ever built. In the spring of 1851, the first travelers came through. A small wagon train from Independence, 6 families bound for Oregon, stopped to water their oxen in the valley below. They didn't know what the hollow had once been. One of them, a farmer from Kentucky, found Burdett's old jail door half buried in mud, the brass star still nailed to. He carried it up to the ridge where Burdett was mending a snare line. "Reckon this yours?" the farmer asked. Burdett studied the star for a long time before answering. "Was," he said. The man nodded slowly. "Place down there, what happened?" Burdett looked out over the valley. "The earth took it back," he said simply. "Didn't leave much worth remembering." The farmer frowned. "Funny, my boy swears he saw smoke down there last night." Burdett smiled faintly. "Maybe you did. Sometimes the past still burns a little." They shared coffee in silence, and when the wagon train moved on, the farmer left the badge behind. Burdett hung it on the inside wall of his cabin, above the hearth. He didn't wear it again, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away either. Years passed. The trail grew busier, more wagons, more faces, all headed west with the same gleam of hope that had built and buried Silver Vein. A few travelers stopped to rest at Burdett's cabin. He'd trade dried meat or a tanned hide for coffee, listen to their stories, and send them on their way. Word spread along the trail of an old lawman who lived alone above a ghost town, a man who could guide you across the Wind River country if you asked right and paid fair. Some said he was half wild, living more like a trapper than a man. Others claimed he was a hermit preacher, still watching over the place where sin had sunk the earth. Nobody really knew. Burdett never corrected them. Legends, he figured, were just another kind of truth, one you didn't argue with. In the summer of 1855, a young reporter from St. Louis rode into his camp. He said his name was Hal Winters, and he was collecting stories of the fur trade and the frontier for the Missouri Gazette. He'd heard of Burdett's name back east, a sheriff, a trapper, a man who'd ridden with Bridger and wanted to know the truth about the lost town of Silver Vein. "You were there," Winters said, his eyes bright with curiosity. "You saw it vanish." Burdett stirred the fire with a stick. "I did." "What caused it?" He looked into the flames a long time before answering. "Greed. Foolishness. Maybe the hand of God. Hard to tell them apart out here." The reporter scribbled notes, hungry for detail. "You could make history, Sheriff. Folks would pay to hear it told right." Burdett shook his head. "Some stories ain't meant for profit." "But it's legend," Winters insisted. "People want to know." Burdett smiled, slow and tired. "Then let 'em want." Winters left the next morning, disappointed but polite. Before he rode off, he asked one last question. "You ever plan to go back east?" Burdett looked toward the horizon, endless, golden, and empty. "I already did once," he said. "Didn't like what I found." That night, alone by the fire, he took out his old logbook page, the one he'd saved from the ruins. The ink had faded, but he could still read the words. "If this is the end of it, I reckon it was earned." He folded it again, tucked it back into his pocket, and watched the embers drift skyward. Above him, the stars burned like they always had, bright, cold, and indifferent. Below, the valley slept, the grass finally growing back over what had once been Silver Vein. And Nathaniel Burdett, the man who stayed, sat watching the night like a sentinel, not waiting for anything to return, but making sure it stayed gone. By the time the 1,870 seconds rolled across the plains, the world that had birthed the mountain men was gone. The iron rails had reached the foothills, the buffalo herds were thinned to ghosts, and the Wind River country, once a wild hush of pines and wind, now trembled with the sound of hammers and saws. Civilization had arrived, dragging its fences and promises behind it. Somewhere above the new wagon route, where the grass grew thin and the land still held its silence, an old cabin sagged against the wind. Travelers rarely noticed it. Those who did said a lone rider sometimes appeared near dusk, watching from the ridge, tall, gray-bearded, coat faded to the color of dust. Most never got close enough to speak. Those few who did said his name was Burdett, and he lived like a man waiting for something that never came. By then, Nathaniel Burdett was older than the West he'd helped tame. His hands shook when he lit his pipe, and his beard had gone white as frost on a rifle barrel. The badge still hung on the wall above his hearth, tarnished and dull, and beside it the page from his old logbook, yellowed by years of smoke. He didn't write any more. There was nothing left to record. Most mornings he rode down to the hollow where Silver Vein had been. Time had softened the scars, willows grew along the creek, and grass covered the earth that had once split open. But every spring, when the thaw came heavy, the land still shifted, revealing bits of its old bones. A length of iron stovepipe, a door hinge, a rusted pickaxe handle. He'd gather them, set them in a pile, and cover them with stones. A grave, of sorts not for people, but for memory itself. He never stayed long. The place had a stillness that pressed on the lungs, like standing in a church after the sermon when even God has gone quiet. It was in the summer of 1872 that a surveyor's team from the Union Pacific stumbled onto his cabin. They were charting a new stage line to Fort Washakie and had heard whispers of a lost town buried in the Wind River foothills. When they found the old man by his fire, they asked if he'd heard of it. Burdett nodded. "Heard of it," he said. "Lived it." The surveyors traded glances. So it was real then? A town called Silver Vein? Once. What happened to it? He poked at the coals with a stick. Same thing that happens to everything men build on sand. It sank. They asked for more names, dates, stories, but Burdett gave them little. "All that's left down there's dust and bad lessons," he said. "Ain't worth your ink." When they left, one of the young surveyors turned back and asked, "Was it true, Sheriff? That you stayed after everyone left?" Burdett smiled faintly. Somebody had to turn out the lights. The men laughed as they rode off, but years later that same surveyor swore he'd seen smoke rising from the hollow below, though he knew no fire had burned there in decades. That winter came early and sharp. The cold found every crack in the cabin walls, every weakness in old bone. Burdett felt it deep, the ache of years, the wear of silence. He spent his days splitting what wood he could, his nights by the fire, watching the flame shift and dance like memory itself. One morning, a trader passing through found the cabin door open. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, and the old man sat in his chair facing the window, coat wrapped tight, pipe in hand. His eyes were open but soft, fixed on the horizon where the Wind Rivers met the sky. They buried him on the ridge overlooking the hollow. The trader marked the grave with a wooden cross carved from the cabin's lintel. On it he scratched a simple line. Years later, when the Museum of the Mountain Man opened in Pinedale, they displayed a single relic said to be from Silver Vein, a tarnished brass star. The points bent and worn smooth by time. The placard beneath it read, "Recovered near the Wind River Range, site of the lost town of Silver Vein, c. 1848, 1850, sheriff unknown." But the trappers and old-timers who still lingered around the Green River rendezvous knew better. They'd tell the tale by firelight of a sheriff who refused to run, of a town swallowed by the earth, of a man who stood his post until the land itself took back the law. And when the wind blew down from the mountains dry, cold, and filled with the scent of pine and dust, they said you could still hear him out there, boots on gravel, badge catching the moonlight, because the land forgets the names of towns and men alike. But sometimes, just sometimes, it remembers the ones who stayed.